Now we get to talk about the different types of metabolic reactions. And so the metabolic reactions are going to take place in the body at body temperature and physiologic pH. And this requires enzymes and often coenzymes. So you have your reaction here, your enzyme, as well as your coenzymes here that are going to be your helper. So let's start off with glycolysis. So this would be like lysing of glucose, okay, or the oxidation and breakdown of glucose. So major sources of energy for the body are glucose, and these are produced when we digest carbohydrates in our food, and glycogen, which is a polysaccharide that's stored in the liver and skeletal muscles. So we're going to learn how to describe the conversion of glucose to pyruvate in glycolysis, and the subsequent conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA or lactate. So glycolysis is kind of like the major metabolic pathway. It starts both aerobic and anaerobic. And so it's a metabolic pathway that uses glucose, and which is a digestion product from those carbohydrates. So it breaks it down into that monosaccharide, which is glucose. And it degrades that 6-carbon glucose molecule into the 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. And this is going to take place in the cytoplasm of the cell. So reactions 1 to 5 of glycolysis, in them, energy is required to add phosphate groups to the glucose. And then glucose is converted into 2 3-carbon molecules that are called pyruvate. So you can see here, you start with 6 carbons, 6 carbons, 6 carbons, and then we branch off, we end up getting 2 3-carbon molecules. And this is happening with both of the 3-carbon molecules. So then we end up with double this amount of ATP. So the first reaction is going to be phosphorylation. And a phosphate from the ATP is added to glucose, and that's going to form glucose 6-phosphatate on ADP. Then reaction 2 is going to be isomerization, and we talked about isomers before. And so basically the glucose 6-phosphate, which is the aldose from reaction 1, is going to undergo isomerization to fructose 6-phosphate, and this is a ketose, and you can follow along in these pictures over here. Well, then in reaction 3, we have phosphorylation. And this is when fructose 6-phosphate reacts with a second ATP, and this adds a second phosphate to the molecule, and it makes it fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Now, you're like, Jana, I think that the whole thing was supposed to be that we are producing ATP, and why are we actually requiring it as an input? I equate this to kind of like when we start your car. You flood your engine, not flood it, but you give it some gas to get it started. So we have to have a little bit of energy to start these processes. And then we go on and we make a whole bunch of ATP. So it works out in the end. Reaction 4 would be that cleavage. And so we've formed this fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, or biphosphate, and it's going to cleave or break apart into 2 3-carbon sugars. So that fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is split into 2 3-carbon phosphate isomers, dihydroxyacetone phosphate, and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Then we move on to reaction 5, and this is again that isomerization. Because dihydroxyacetone phosphate is a ketone, it cannot react further. And it undergoes isomerization to provide a second molecule of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and this can now be oxidized. Now, with all the 6-carbon atoms from the glucose, they're now contained into 2 identical triose, tri meaning 3, phosphates. Okay, so remember, we always have to account for every single atom. So 6 carbons broken down into 2 3-carbon atoms. So then we go on to reaction 6, and this is where we're actually going to make the energy. So this is the oxphos, right? Oxidation and phosphorylation. The aldehyde group of each glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is oxidized into a carboxyl group by the coenzyme NAD+, which is then reduced to NADH and the extra hydrogen that we talked about previously. A phosphate adds the new carboxyl groups to form 2 molecules of the high-energy compound 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Okay. Now we go to reaction 7, and this is a phosphate transfer. And this is where phosphorylation transfers a phosphate group from the 1,3-bisphosphoglyceride to ADP, and this produces glycerate. And it's producing 2 molecules of ATP, and at this point, the 2 ATPs are produced, balancing out the 2 ATPs that are consumed in reactions 1 and 3. So now we're at a wash. We used 2 to start, we just made 2, and we're now equal. Then we go on to reaction 8, and this is isomerization. This is when those 3-phosphoglycerate molecules isomerize, and they're going to move from the phosphate group from the carbon 3 up to the carbon 2, and this is going to yield 2 phosphoglycerates. And then the last reaction is going to be the dehydration reaction. Okay, well, for this reaction 9. It's not the last reaction, but in this slide. And each phosphoglycerate undergoes dehydration to give 2 high-energy molecules of phosphophenols. Okay? So then reaction 10 is we are going to generate the energy, right? So we're going to transfer that phosphate. So in the second direct phosphate transfer, the phosphate groups from 2-phosphophenols are transferred to 2 ADPs to form 2 pyruvates and 2 ATPs. So again, we're going to get these 2 pyruvates, because remember this happens in sequence, so it has the other one over here, and then we're producing 2 ATPs. So we have a net production of 2 ATP. All right, so in glycolysis, we start with 2 ATPs. These are going to add the phosphate to the glucose and fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Then 4 ATPs are produced during the whole phosphate transfers. So because of this, 4 minus 2, we have a net gain of 2 ATP, as well as 2 NADHs that are produced when glucose is turned into or converted into that pyruvate. So here is your overall diagram that you'll see the formula. C6H12O6, this is glucose, plus 2 ADP, plus 2 inorganic phosphates, plus 2 NAD pluses. That is going to form 2 pyruvates, plus 2 ATPs, 2 NADHs, and 4 hydrogens. All right, so let's check our study. So in glycolysis, what compounds provide phosphate groups for the production of ATP? Pause me and come back. All right, so in reaction 7, the phosphate groups from 2,1,3-bisphosphoglycerates molecules are transferred to ADP to form 2 ATP. And then in reaction 10, phosphate groups from 2 phosphophenol pyruvate molecules are used to form 2 more ATP. Great, great job, you guys.